Hello, and welcome to the United States Institute of Peace event today, Countering the Coups in the Greater Sahel. I am Joseph Sani, Vice President of USIP Africa Center. For those of you who may be new to USIP, we are a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by the US Congress. We are dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible and essential for US global security. Like many of you, we at USIP have been tracking closely the coup d'etat in the Greater Sahel region, as the rise in military rule puts an already fragile region in greater risk of generalized instability. Army officers have seized power in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sudan, and Chad. Coup makers have taken advantage of weak governments struggling to provide basic services in expansive countries. This is due to underlying factors made worse by stressors such as COVID-19, climate change, and violent extremism. Poor security and weak governance are major problems. Despite international support, governments in the Greater Sahel have largely failed to tackle the rise of armed groups, which have led to great human suffering. Despite these failings, though, popular support for democracy remains strong in the region and throughout Africa. That is certainly the case in Sudan, where there have been popular uprisings since the coup. At the Africa Center, we recognize that each country is different, but there are common drivers of instability. Today, we will hear from our distinguished panel some policy recommendations to address instability and reverse this worrisome trend of coups. We are delighted that Ambassador Kamisa Kamara will lend her expertise in navigating this timely conversation. Kamisa is a senior visiting expert for the Sahel here at USIP and has served as Mali's foreign minister, among other high-level positions. Kamisa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sani, for setting the scene. I am delighted to be joined by such esteemed panelists to think through possible and practical options for responding to the coups we've observed in the Greater Sahel. I will start by introducing the discussants. Vemba Dizolele, good morning and welcome. Vemba is a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He's also a lecturer in African Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Cameron Hudson is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. He previously served as the senior strategic advisor at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Thank you so much for joining us, Cameron. Joshua Mizervi is the senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation, where he focuses on geopolitics, counterterrorism, and refugee policy. And last but not least, Dr. Joe Siegel leads the research program at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, where he produces excellent region products with the aim of generating policy-relevant analysis that contribute to addressing Africa's security challenges. At this point, I would like to invite the audience to join the conversation we're about to have with the hashtag Countering Coups on social media, or posing questions for the panel directly in the chat box on the event webpage. We'll turn the discussion towards those questions for the final portion of the conversation. But first, I would like to kick us off with a question for all panelists. What are ways the international community can become more constructively engaged in response to the coups. We've had many coups over the past couple of years, and there have been questions about what the international community can do, what their responses have been, what their responses could have been. Cameron, how about you start?
Well, thanks, Camissa, and thanks to USIP for this conversation and for all the great work that you've been doing over the course of the months as these coups have unfolded. I think that one thing that we have to think about, just to start this conversation, is when we talk about what should we do, I think maybe a better way to pose that question is what shouldn't we be doing? And part of what we shouldn't maybe be doing is what we have been doing, right? I think that what strikes me when I look back at the course of the last 6 months or year that we've seen these coups emerge, and frankly, the storm clouds were on the horizon, well before that. You haven't seen a great pivot in international policy towards the Sahel region in either response to these coups or as the sort of storm clouds were gathering. And I think that we, as part of the international community, but certainly as sort of the Western, a leader of the Western Security Alliance that has been, very heavily engaged, literally with boots on the ground across this region for the better part of the past decade, we really need to rethink our own approach to this. Looking beyond the kind of local drivers of conflict, which I know we'll talk about, I think we in the West have to, turn the gaze on ourselves a bit and really interrogate the role that our security approach, our security relationships have played in, I think, undermining both civilian rule across the region, but also, I think, playing into what has emerged as a very kind of dysfunctional power dynamic across the region, where you have, France, the United States, and other European partners essentially going in and pursuing a set of very hard strategic interests, which I don't think are particularly well balanced with the values that we espouse related to democracy and civilian rule. And I know we often talk about this kind of values and interests argument and tug of war, but I think you're really seeing it play out across the region in fairly dangerous ways. And I think we're now starting to see some of the kind of second order and third order effects of that, this sort of rising anti-Western sentiment, certainly rising anti-French sentiment across the region, anti-state sentiment, whereby the security partners that we have been engaging with are themselves, in many cases, the worst violators of civilian rights and the worst, committers of atrocities in the region, even more in some cases than the jihadist groups that we're claiming to combat. And so I think we have to really look hard at ourselves at how can we better balance our, very real and very legitimate security concerns and strategic concerns in the region with the kind of the values approach to supporting democratic rule, supporting state institutions, and how can we better, I think, rebalance our relationships so that we are not putting so much in the in the basket of security services. I think there's just two data points that I would make very clearly. One is we have General Hemeti in Sudan going to Russia today in the midst of a huge crisis, reaching out to Russia at a moment when Russia is commanding the attention on the world stage. And then secondly, we have Operation Flintlock going on across the continent right now, getting lots of media attention. It's our biggest, military security operation on the continent annually. And it just strikes me that we never talk about the work that we're trying to do to build democracies and to build sustainable institutions in the same way that we talk about the military partnerships that we have. And I think that has to change.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. Josh, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll echo Cameron's thanks to you, Camissa, and to Dr. Sani and USIP, both for hosting this panel, but also the work you've been doing on the coups. Yeah, so I'll make maybe a few obvious points right at the very beginning here. One, these are hugely complex issues, and I think we need to be very careful about trying to reduce them to a few causal factors. You could probably, if we all sat down, we could probably come up with 100 different reasons why these things have happened, and some of them are unique to each situation. We also need to have some humility, I think, about what the U.S. can actually accomplish in some of these areas. Every time there's a coup, there's a lot of introspection as well. There should be, and I totally endorse Cameron's comments about taking a much harder look at how we do security assistance, for instance, and ensure that we are not creating a very competent branch of the military, while the civilian elements do not keep pace. The civilian elements should be at least as competent as the military components. But my analysis of this is that coups are a symptom of a problem. Coups are a symptom of bad governance. And I really think that's what so many of these problems boil down to. And the harsh reality here is that the West has not figured out yet, or anyone else has figured out yet, how to effectively build legitimate institutions in some of these countries. And I would argue it's something we can't do anyways. It's at the very best, we can come alongside partners on the ground who are involved in this work. And that would be maybe my first recommendation here, is that as we approach this problem, our laser focus must be on local actors who have some legitimacy themselves, who are fighting the good fight. There's a lot of brave people fighting for better governance and democracy and everything else in some of these countries. That's really where we should be focused, and coming alongside them and not trying to impose some sort of blueprint for governance that might have worked elsewhere, but is not necessarily appropriate to the exact conditions in those places. This is not a defense of we should absolutely be promoting democracy. That's not what I'm saying. But the idea that in some of these places, a very strong central government is the right form of government, I'm not sure that's true. Actually, think about Mali and just the sheer physical distance between Bamako and the north, where some of these problems are, sort of festered for so many years and then spread south. I think the U.S. needs to think more creatively about more highly federalized systems where you devolve power to local constituencies. Again, this goes back to my point about coming alongside local actors who are working really hard to deliver governance that is legitimate and brings a certain level of security to local people. Again, very difficult to do and would require sort of a shift, I think, in how we view some of these situations, because when we tackle governance problems, at least the US always comes at it from, well, we're going to go through the central government, we need to figure out a way to strengthen the central government, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that's totally appropriate. But other times, it's unclear to me if that's really where we should be putting all of our focus and energy. And maybe we should be thinking more about, okay, how do we empower local actors who have some legitimacy with their people already? Cameron made the excellent point. Some of these militaries we talk about are just as feared, if not more feared than some of the terrorist organizations. We need to, if we put all of our eggs in that basket, we may just be starting off on the back foot from the very beginning. Again, it's hard, right? And it would take a lot of very in-depth analysis and understanding of the local situations in all of these places, but it's not working what we're doing by and large. I'm not one of these people who thinks it's all the West's fault. It's absolutely not. People launch coups because they want to launch coups. These men have taken power because they want power. Ultimately, it's their responsibility. but clearly we're not as effective as we want to be in promoting democracy and good governance. So, we were tasked to come up with some sort of practical recommendations, and I'm going to be trying to be a little provocative in my recommendations. So that would be my first one. Like, think more about federalized systems maybe, and how do we prop up local actors who already have some level of legitimacy with people, with the locals, who ultimately will determine the fate of governments. If a government is illegitimate with its own people, it will not survive.
Thank you very much. So both you and Cameron actually agree on the fact that we haven't been doing our best, or what we've been doing up until now hasn't really worked, and that these situations are very complex. So let me actually turn to Vemba, because we're talking about the international community, but at the regional and continental level, we have the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. We have the African Union, who've been very involved in the response to the coups. And so over the past few months, we've had coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, a coup attempt in Guinea-Bissau. So Vemba, what can we say about the current and future role, I should say, of both organizations in preventing coups from happening? Again, they've been very involved, very vocal. They've applied sanctions here and there. The EU has physically been present in some of those countries to mitigate some of the consequences of these coups. So we're all very curious about what the current status of their effectiveness is, and then maybe what their future role will be in the region.
Thank you very much, Camisa, and thank you to USIP, Dr. Sani, for the work you do and for hosting this event. I think the issue and the question about the AU, the African Union, and ECOWAS are actually very pertinent, in the sense that I think both organizations have a lot of internal problems. And I'm not sure they're well equipped to handle these issues, in part because of things that they did themselves. The AU has not particularly upheld its charter when it comes to democracy and putting the aspirations of the African peoples ahead of the interests of the people in power. We need to admit that the AU primarily, it's a club of presidents, and those presidents often are not doing particularly a good job in meeting the aspirations of their own people. I've always had a soft spot for ECOWAS. I think ECOWAS was one of the few ranked regional economic organization that actually worked. I know ECOWAS has a track record of challenging coups and other abuses of power by leaders, but that has fallen by the wayside in the last few years, or last several years, actually. So on one hand, we saw ECOWAS take a firm stand in the Gambia, for instance, when Yahya Jammeh was trying to stick around. That leadership is no longer there. So we saw in places like, there's this dichotomy that we see where they so focus on military coups as if this is like the ultimate aberration that can happen in that space, when in fact, there's a spectrum of aberrations that are happening in that space. One of them that gets a free pass all the time, it's constitutional coups. And constitutional coups, by this I mean a leader in power who seeks to manipulate the constitution so he can stay longer than originally elected in for. We saw this in Cote d'Ivoire, we saw this in Guinea. And when that happens, it's actually an alarm. It should be a red flag. And I think the international community, in this case ECOWAS, should come as strongly on that as they come on as much as they do on military coups. So I think that ECOWAS particularly has become quite ineffective in the region. We see, of course, whether we agree with coups or not, that the last coups we've seen have been pretty popular. And that's a question that we need to look at closely. So the idea that just because it's a coup, we have to oppose it, yeah, okay, fair. But a coup is a coup is a coup, whether it's constitutional or not. And I think countries like Nigeria, in the case of ECOWAS, need to step up and play the role that they've played traditionally, which we know, taking the leadership in the sub-region. The AU, in my view, in my humble opinion, has become problematic. The AU, while they have commissions that are trying to do impressive work like peace and stability and so on, but when it comes to really serving the aspirations of the African peoples, the AU has failed. So the military coups, military officers, while military coups are not the solution to the problems, I think it's time we should consider them just as an expression of public discontent, as they are the expression of public discontent. So my recommendation in this case will be to go back to the drawing board for, especially for ECOWAS, since we're talking about Sahel, and starting holding government accountable as per their charter. African people are not duped. We can call it whatever we want. They know that their needs are not being met. So that, I think, is the context that we need to keep in mind as we look at this. Back to you, Camisa.
Thank you, Vemba. So are you saying that both the ECOWAS and the AU have lost some sort of legitimacy in the region? That they're not being perceived as credible organizations anymore, like at least the ECOWAS used to back in the early 2000s?
Absolutely. I think both organizations do not have credibility in the eyes of the populations. And we saw this with the sanctions on Mali. Right after it happened in Mali, we saw protests in the streets. In Senegal and neighboring countries, it was very counterproductive. Senegal is the largest trading partner to Mali. So when you do a sanction, you are not just punishing the transitional government in Mali, as they call themselves, but you literally stifling trade between on both sides of the border. Just one example. So what is the purpose of that? And then the reality of a military government comes to power and we say you need to step down, you need to organize election within 6 months, within a year. Is that credible in the sense that a country like Mali faced a lot of problems, whether the military took over or not? It's not clear when the election would have been organized in any meaningful way. So how do we engage that group of officers in a way that is really practical? That they want to stay longer, obviously, is not acceptable, but is 13 months, 1 year, is that enough? Those are also questions that I think do not really face the reality or reflect the reality on the ground.
Thank you very much, Vemba. Joe, let me ask you this. So we're talking about the international community. We're talking about regional and continental organization in Africa. Now I want to take a look at U.S. military assistance. Both Cameron and Josh did say that something went wrong there. So where the U.S. has been a leading force is arguably in hard security and training and equipping militaries in the region. And in fact, 3 of the 5 successful coups we're discussing today were led by officers who had received training by US forces. Sometimes I wonder if it's just an anecdote or if that's even relevant. But are there any lessons to learn from how US security assistance was prioritized in the Sahel?
Thanks, Camisa, and let me echo my appreciation for being part of the panel today. Well, I would start by just trying to be clear. You know, we need to be careful about not confusing the fact that there are problems, that there have been problems in these Sahelian countries, whether it be corruption, whether it be security, and the fact that then we are seeing these coups. The one doesn't justify the other. And I think we need to just continue to remind ourselves, these coups are purely about opportunistic mid-level officers trying to seek power. They're not trying to advance democracy. They're not conducting reforms. They're not addressing the needs of the people. They're not doing anything in terms of innovations about addressing the security threats that these countries face. It's a pure and simple power grab. And therefore, in terms of international response, I think it's absolutely imperative that these coup makers be condemned and isolated. So I think the international community has a very essential role to play in not recognizing these coups. And I think it's important to remember these coups are all still in process. They haven't been consolidated. It's important to push back. It's important not to recognize. It's important not to give them legitimacy. They need that legitimacy in order to be sustained. And so it's a very fluid situation still. We shouldn't look at these just as in the past tense. And these coups, coup leaders are all politically isolated. They're economically isolated. And it is important that international community supports ECOWAS in continuing that isolation so that they do hand over power to a transitional civil authority so that we can move forward towards elections and some sort of democratic process. In terms of the question about security cooperation, clearly the fact that we've had these mid-level officers seize power reflects a problem in the way these security institutions are operating. But I would suggest that it isn't, we need to be careful we don't generalize. This isn't the entire military in these countries that have been dysfunctional. These are factions within the military, power-seeking factions that have seized power. And so I think we want to focus on what broke down rather than offering, broad stroke criticisms of the entire military structures, which I believe, there have been very genuine and constructive steps forward in terms of building military professionalism and effectiveness. Obviously, they haven't been sufficient. But I think really what we're looking at with these coups is the problem of having elite forces that are operating outside the standard command and control structures that were able to mobilize a small group of well-armed and well-organized colleagues to seize power. These came from the middle hierarchy of the command structure. These were not the generals. In the case of the Sahelian governments in Sudan, it's a different situation. And therefore, I think, one of the lessons is that we need to make sure that any of these special forces that are created to try to deal with the insurgencies are part of the ordinary army, that they are responsive to the command and control. We've seen problems with these elite factions in that they get disproportionate amount of resources, training, arms, and so it creates frictions within the rest of the military structures that are out there. So I think better to be working and trying to strengthen the capacity and effectiveness of the entire military institutions and the command and control structures rather than just focusing so much on these elite forces. There's a lot more to say. I guess the last point I'll throw in at this point is, it is imperative that we recognize the role that militaries play in democratic processes. And I think that has been overlooked, that unless the militaries are coming along and they support and recognize the importance of having civilian-led democratic leadership, they're always going to be a source of vulnerability to successful democracies. And so we need to redouble our efforts to strengthen the norms of civil-military relationships and the importance of controls and strictures on the huge responsibility given to militaries and the bearing of arms in these societies, which are explicitly intended to defend citizens and defend constitutions. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on strengthening those norms of democracies and the norms of civil military relationships within these military institutions. But I would say there's a lot there to build on. There's a lot of good work that has been done, and we want to recognize that and work with that.
Thank you so much for this, Joe. So we're here to talk about or to make policy recommendations about how to counter coups. What are the strategies to counter coups? And in your remarks, you did say that the coup makers should be somehow isolated. So my question to you would be, do you think that sanctions, like the ones that the ECOWAS applied, are actually an effective measure to counter coups?
I do support the sanctions. And yes, there are going to be costs, but these are costs that these coup makers have taken upon themselves and taken upon their countries. They are the ones who stepped forward and decided that they are going to be the sovereign representatives of their states. They do not have legitimacy. They do not have popularity. Sure, there were some people on the streets, but many more people oppose these regimes. And we have seen in Mali how the Assimi Goïta and the coup leaders there have been sponsoring youth militias to attack opponents. We've seen opposition politicians speaking out against the coup. Same thing in Burkina Faso. These guys did not win elections. They decided for themselves to take on those authorities. And they're acting in their interest. They're not acting on the interest of the general population. So yes, sanctions, cutting these guys off, they should not have access to the sovereign accounts of these states. And it recognizes their vulnerability, their fragility in trying to hold on to power. And I think that has been a miscalculation on the part of ECOWAS and the international community to give them too much rope, to give them too much leeway, to expect that they're going to lead a transition. That is not their intention. And the longer we play this out, the more troublesome it's going to get. So yes, they need to be isolated. And the pressure point here should be they need to transition to some sort of civilian-led interim government that's technocratic, that can host a genuine transition process that's leading to elections and a restoration of civilian-led government.
Thank you, Joe. Cameron, I see you nodding. Do you agree with what Joe just said about sanctions being an important and maybe an effective measure to counter coups?
Well, I think we have to look at where those sanctions are coming from. And I do think that with respect to what Joe said, I think that sanctions that are coming from ECOWAS, coming from African peers are effective. I think that they send both an effective signal and given the kind of trade patterns that exist within the sub-region, I think they can be very powerful, especially when you look at a landlocked country like Mali, for example. The region can play an important part in putting pressure, economic pressure on coup makers. But I think, we're sitting in Washington, many of us, and so from the perspective of international sanctions, I'm starting to question really the value beyond the signaling. Obviously, a sanction from the EU or from Washington sends a signal of discontent. But at the end of the day, I think what we haven't talked about is the changing geopolitics of the region and the fact that you now have a much more important role that Russia is trying to play, China has been playing, and a host of kind of middle power countries from Turkey, Qatar, the Emirates, the Saudis, across the region. And so I think that the power and effectiveness of international sanctions on coup makers is eroding, both the more we use them, but also the more we see these kind of new entrants who are, in fact, I think, taking advantage of the fact and seeing an opportunity and an opening where there are gaps between the U.S. and Western governments and local governments. They are filling that vacuum and creating new relationships in a way that I think will continue to erode the the utility of some of the sanctions that we've been relying upon up till now. So I think we need to expand the toolkit beyond just economic sanctions, because there are ways around them now, and these countries are getting very, very good at avoiding the worst effects of them.
Thank you. Josh, we need to expand the toolkit. That's what Cameron said. I didn't. Any ideas about what tools we can come up with?
Yeah, and I'll just endorse what Cameron just said. I am more and more hesitant about sanctions. I think they're totally appropriate in some situations, but I also think people have baked these into their calculations now. They know sanctions will come, and they have a plan for avoiding them. Now, that doesn't mean they've calculated correctly. And there is, again, virtue to demonstrating our discontent with what's going on. And we don't do sectoral sanctions. We only do targeted sanctions. But even those can have, let's be honest, those can have a chilling effect on other types of economic activity in these countries, which hurt ordinary people. Again, sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes that's what must be done. I would like us to be a little bit more cautious before we reach for that hammer. Now, as far as what other tools we have, yeah, I think there are some other ones. I like visa bans, like travel bans. That really hurts. Some of these elite families and who like to jet off, especially if you can coordinate this with our European friends and others. Everybody comes to UNGA, right? Like, the United States is under no obligation to allow people who come to UNGA to wander the city or go beyond the limits of the perimeter of the UN. So if you really want to start putting the screws to these folks, you can say, look, we can't stop you from coming to UNGA, but you're only allowed within this very small perimeter. Some of these ruling elites, they have family adults. I would only focus on adults. I would never look at children or minors, but they have adult children or other family members who are living large off of the, oftentimes stolen, stolen money and other resources. And you can say, sorry, like we have to revoke your visa. You might even, be a 23-year-old in college, but I'm sorry, like, you have to go. Because you have to focus on the elites themselves, because they don't care in many cases what happens to their people. I'm going to just say it very, very openly here. Like Joe is exactly right. I think on the people who have seized power in these coups, it's about themselves and their power.
Josh, let me interrupt you. Sorry.
Sure.
So, but the people who seize power are not elites. Sometimes they didn't even have passports before they actually seized the coup. So how are the visa bans effective on them? Because it's not even part of their lifestyle to just travel the world.
Yeah, it won't work for everyone, but some of them are elites. Some do go off to Dubai and Doha all the time, or New York. So you'd have to make it, obviously it would only work for those who do like to travel about. And I'm always, so there's, there are financial tools. Again, I want us to be cautious about sanctions, but if we're going to go that route, we need to make them as pointed as possible and try to avoid those types of sanctions that have larger societal effects, and really home in on the perpetrators themselves. And we should be willing to go up to the top on some of it. I think of, this wasn't the coup situation, but I think of South Sudan a lot, where we put sanctions on a few sort of mid to like low upper level people, but we never touched the people who were really driving the violence. So I think sometimes we have to be willing to make that decision. It's hard because, again, a lot of these people have baked this into their calculations. They know this is coming and they've protected themselves in some ways. So I said at the very beginning, we need to have some humility about what we can accomplish. But the U.S. is not the decisive actor in many of these places anymore. There are other countries with much greater influence than us, and we should coordinate with them as much as we can to try to have some sort of united effort. But at the end of the day, we can throw the kitchen sink at some people and they're not leaving. I think the situation in Sudan is a really good example of this.
Thank you, Josh. Zamba, let me turn to you. So I've seen on social media some local reactions to international responses to coups. Could be a French response to the coups in Guinea or Burkina or Mali, and then the US response or non-response. And some citizens in some of those countries do think that coups are extremely local, that they should be dealt with at the national level, and that the international community should not even be involved. What do you say about that?
I think this is the challenge, Camisa, about how we handle these coups. I mean, we're here trying to find recommendations. It's really contextualized. Every coup is very different. If in the context of the Sahel today, the coups are happening within the context of heightened terrorism and violence. If you're a regular citizen and this is happening to you, it doesn't really matter what Paris, what Washington thinks, because if you can identify with the people in power, and especially we need to remember whether this is rhetoric, whether it's true, a lot of the military systems that military leaders that have taken over in the Sahel have all pointed to the lack of support they get from the civilian leadership. We need to contextualize, to dismiss them and say they're all grabbing power for the sake of power. That may be the case, but there's a specific context that gives them cover for what they're doing. We cannot decouple those. It is impossible. Sanogo walked from the field to headquarters to do his coup because he had some grievances. In Burkina Faso, whether this is, again, just a question of public relations, but the population identifies with that to a certain level. So we cannot dismiss that. Therefore, the local element becomes very important. When we talk about stability, whose stability are we talking about? That remains not just a philosophical question, it's a real question. The farmers who cannot go to the field because there's terrorism, how do they relate to this situation? Which is totally different from me sitting in Washington, D.C. So there's that element, but I also want to go back a little bit to the extending the toolkit. We mentioned earlier that our engagement, international community engagement, has been primarily state-focused or military-focused. What I would like to see more of, we just heard a few weeks ago that the United States, for instance, had decided to become a full active member of the Sahel Alliance. I think the US has the clout and the gravitas and the coordination and the money capability to start asking for it to carve a bigger space for civil society. Civil society is much more representative of the need of the people than the military, however we look at the military. And often, unfortunately, civil society is not around those tables. And when they are at the table, it's very minimal. I think that role needs to be expanded. And we also need to have a longer horizon. The notion that we can just put pressure on people, then the problem will go away, it's absurd. And we've seen this over the years. The other element, again, I'm going to focus on Mali because it's the bigger country in the region and what's happening there is a lot of impact. Mali, if we remember, used to be one of the leaders in democracy. And when they did what they did to be the leader in democracy, they barely got any support from the same countries that are making noise today. So we need to start increasing our democratic engagement. Here I'm speaking from the US perspective. Democracy is an important pillar of US foreign policy. Flint talk is all good for whatever set of reasons that it serves. But I think the NDIs of the world, the IRI of the world, the NED of the world, they're doing tremendous work with really little means. I think we need to engage with civil society. And I think to me, and for me, that's an important toolkit that needs to be elevated. Other countries don't work in that space. France doesn't work in a democracy space. So for an African, when they look at France, they see the same thing they've been seeing for the last 50 years. That means military operations, military operations, military operations. Any African of a certain age can rattle at least half a dozen military operations. So what are they leading to? And so to me, that's just what I wanted to put out there. I think it's important that we handle those within their context.
Thank you. So again, we're here to talk about recommendations and, countering coups. But one of the more complex questions that some of us have in mind is, how do you actually recover from a coup? And on what terms? Who should the coup makers count on? Who should the international community work with? Remember, you talked about the civil society. And this is a question to all of you. How do we move forward? We've had many coups, and actually West Africa was coined a coup belt. I think it was maybe in the 60s, because the region was so prone to coups after independence. And so, the big question is, how do we move forward from here? The Atlantic Council Africa Center, we're talking here to CSIS, we have the ACSS, we have the Heritage Foundation. How do we all work together, and how do we move forward? Maybe Joe.
Thanks, Camisa. Well, I think the way we move forward depends on how we respond in the present. And to the extent that coups become an acceptable means of transition, then we're going to see more coups. So I think it's very important that we do take a hard line with these coup makers. I do think I would reiterate, they are politically very vulnerable. And this is where the role of regional international actors is important, because if they get that recognition, then they'll have the foundation, they'll be able to consolidate their coup, and they'll stay in power. And once they're there, they have no intention of giving up that power. So we're going to be dealing with the dysfunctions that they bring for years to come. So I think it's imperative that we take a very strong stance against these individuals, and try to move again to a civilian-led transitional authority that can then lead to elections. We should not be looking at the coup makers to be transitioning. That isn't their goal, and they haven't taken any steps in that direction. In terms of other things that we can be doing, I do think it's important to recognize and understand that these coups are happening in fragile states, and with weak institutions and countries that haven't been on a democratic path for very long. And so it shouldn't be surprising that they're weak and they're vulnerable to different challenges, especially with the stresses we've talked about with COVID and with these jihadist insurgencies that are out there. And so I think it is important that we are more supportive of these countries. And I think we need to be more strategic, as I think some of the other panelists are also suggesting. Our engagement needs to be institutionally based. It is that institutional resiliency which is going to be the most important thing for coup-proofing over the longer term. And Mbemba mentioned civil society. I think that's really important. We're seeing the value of active civil society in Sudan, and maintaining that domestic pressure on the coup there. I would focus on the justice sector, that independence of the justice sector, is important when either coup makers or incumbent regimes try to manipulate constitutions so they can stay in power longer. To the extent that you have a judiciary that can act independently, that's an important bulwark against those sorts of actions. I think we want to be investing more in independent electoral commissions so that when votes are held, they're valid. And we've seen a deterioration in the independence of these electoral commissions, and therefore it's easier to manipulate the outcomes of these elections. I think we want to be focusing on the on legislatures, which have often failed to provide a counterbalance to the over-empowered executive branches in many of these weak federal systems. That is a means of getting popular representation into the democratic process. And I would then also highlight the importance of protecting media. You know, media are the guardians of debate and opposition voices. You can't have accountability. You can't have debates if you don't have freedom of expression, freedom of the press. And again, we've seen a deterioration in these freedoms in recent years. More needs to be done to back that up. In many ways, the freedom of the press is the canary in the coal mine. And when you don't have that, then it makes it a lot easier to manipulate other parts of these democratic processes. So what I'm saying is we need to invest across a whole series of democratic institutions, recognizing that this is a decade or two long process. And to recognize that, you know, there has been progress in some places, but it has to be sustained. And you know, we're starting at a weak and at a fragile place in many of these countries. So it's going to be a sustained effort, but it's that resiliency that will be important. You know, there will always be problems in any country, even in wealthy democracies today. There are economic problems, there are political problems, there are security problems. Those do not provide a justification for coups. And I think that's where we want to be getting at in Africa, that yes, there will be problems, even under democracies. That does not then excuse militaries stepping in. And we can help buffer against that impulse when we strengthen this plethora of democratic institutions on the ground.
Thank you, Joe. Cameron, how do you move forward?
Well, listen, I think Joe has laid out a number of really good recommendations and suggestions, and I would just, associate myself with all of those. I think, frankly, a lot of those are captured under some tools that we already have that we haven't been using. I think, namely, of the Global Fragility Act. I think, there are a lot of what I would call early warning indicators, right, of coup behavior. And we can identify those countries. The Freedom House does a great job of ranking many of those indicators already. And so there's an actionable, set of indicators that we can be looking at and trying to either arrest the deterioration in those indicators or turn them around through various USG initiatives. I think also of USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, right, which we're using right now in a place like Sudan. But I think we also have to get better at engaging at the sort of local level, the sort of non-elite level. And I frankly, I struggle with how to do that. Vemba mentioned the IRIs, the IFASs, the NDIs, the NEDs. I think those are organizations that are doing incredible work at a local level that need to be built up and sustained. But I look at a place like Sudan right now, which I've spent a lot of time on, where you have, in fact, a very organized counter-coup protest movement that has emerged and really been the backbone of the revolution for the past 3 years in Sudan. And still, I think we struggle with how to engage with that community of activists on the ground. I think our diplomats, not just in Sudan, but across the board, are not set up, that we're not purpose-built for engaging with mass protest movements or even with kind of broad-based civil society. And I think we need to be better. Our diplomats need to be better trained in how to do that and how we can kind of tap into that. Again, I think Dr. Sani mentioned at the beginning, there's a certain irony here that despite having all these coups, the Afrobarometer polls all demonstrate that, for 65 to 75% of respondents in the Sahel think that, democracy is the best form of government. Similar percentages reject military rule and military coups. And if you just look at the sort of the demographics of the region, this is not a problem that's going away. Those poll numbers are even higher for younger people in these countries. And so given the fact that you have this enormous youth bulge that is going to continue to make these demands for change, I think we have to be better at understanding and tapping into and engaging with not just the non-elites, but the youth who are driving these conversations. I think many, internally in these countries, many of the political parties, they don't have youth wings anymore. They are not rejuvenating their thinking, right? I mean, you look at many of these countries where they, you have these communist trained, octogenarians, trying to lead a political party based upon, sort of 1960s thinking of economics and politics, really feeling very disconnected from, I think, the youth in those countries. And so we have to understand that there are generational shifts at play and how we can position ourselves in engaging and understanding what is to come. Because again, I think this is, as Joe said, this is a 20-year plus transformation of trying to prevent these things from happening, but we have to be on the leading edge of the response.
Thank you. So, yeah, I agree with everything that you said. And, before we go to Q&A, I really wanted to ask one question that is an important one. Human rights violations. We don't necessarily talk about human rights violations a lot when coups happen and when exceptional measures are put in place. But how do we ensure that these are respected and not violated in this exceptional period? Because that's a coup period is an exceptional period. Maybe Josh, in 2 minutes.
Sure, I can probably do it in less than 2 minutes because I'm not sure I have any great ideas beyond some of what we've already discussed here, because you're right. Human rights violations are inherent in these types of political upheavals. And it's, I think Sudan maybe is the best example of this right now, where we've really struggled to have any sort of meaningful influence over how the security services are responding to mass protests in that country. Obviously, we have to condemn it when it happens. I think we have to document it very closely. So we should be in really close contacts, of course, with folks on the ground. Civil society has been a theme of this conversation, and I'll keep going on that theme, because they often have some of the better information that you can get. And then perhaps one of the best things we can do is after the fact, honestly. We want to prevent it, but it happens. And so it is important how we respond to it after the fact, in the sense of, are there accountability measures? that we can support. So is there a truth and reconciliation process that we can support, or something along those lines? There's no satisfying answer here. At least I don't have a satisfying answer, even for myself. Because beyond what we've talked about with sanctions and other creative means and condemnation, it's very difficult.
That's good. That's a good answer.
Camisa, can I add one thing?
Please, go ahead.
To the audience. I agree with all the nuances and all the perspectives that my colleagues have shared. One thing that always stands out for me, it's when there is a coup, the international community always calls for a return to the constitutional order. And the question that comes next is, which constitutional order? Typically, the condition that leads to a coup, that means there's a broken order. That's why things are happening the way they're happening. So I just want to underscore the point that when countries are actually struggling towards democracy, towards good governance, that's the time the international community need really to buttress them with all the support they need. The problem is, during that time, again, to stay with Mali, we had a transition from in 1990 with ATT and others. Mali did not get the full support of the international community at that time. So the problem that existed before continued to exist throughout and gotten even worse as time went by. So the international community, whatever that is, the donor countries, in this case, the Sahel Alliance and others, really have to invest in that space. Not to wait, because we put so much burden on these countries that are transitioning to democracy, expecting them to behave like Norway, when in fact they need all the support that they need, the way we gave Eastern European countries that were transitioning. No country in Africa received that level of support. And I think if we want to see less coups, that's an element that we need to put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vamba. On these words of wisdom, we are going to turn to some of the questions that have come from our audience. First question here: what are the strategic concerns in the region, and how does the West balance supporting democracies in Africa while working with others led by entrenched leaders? Who wants to take on this one?
Well,
Josh, you're smiling, so. Or Joe.
Yeah, just to move this forward, I think what the question is getting at is a point alluded to earlier, that you have other external actors like Russia that is trying to opportunistically fill the vacuum created to expand its regional influence. And so what should the US and other international actors do? I would, I would say it is important to recognize that, Russia is pursuing what I call an asymmetric strategy in Africa. It isn't investing a lot of resources, but it is pumping up disinformation in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Sudan, to try and prop up its proxies there. And so by co-opting these coup leaders, they are trying to gain outsized influence given their minimal investments in these countries. Similarly with what they're doing with the Wagner mercenaries, they're sending them there not to provide security, but to help protect and sustain these coup actors. And so in the process, displacing the French and Western influence, disparaging democratic norms, which is all part of the disinformation campaign. And so I would say, from a geopolitical standpoint, we want to make sure Russia incurs cost for their destabilizing actions. They should be exposed and held accountable for this. I think it goes to all the more importance for why we need to support and incentivize democracy. where we have to underscore why it's important to maintain constitutional order and have legal successions. To the extent that we support and tolerate any lawless seizure of power, we're going to see more of that. And that plays into the hands of the Russias of the world. They cannot compete on a level playing field where countries are operating according to the rule of law. They don't have a lot of investment or trade that they can offer Africa. And so they're trying these asymmetric means to try to expand their influence. So I think the U.S. can assert its geostrategic interests by supporting democracy, supporting stronger institutions, and sustaining them over time, so that we have the long-term relationships that are going to be beneficial to our economic and security interest in Africa.
Thank you, Joe. I am looking at a question for Josh. In context with a weak central state, how can foreign actors empower local actors without contributing to power fragmentation and local power grabs? That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Of course, it's challenging. You do need a framework that has a role for a central government, obviously, right? And that central government is, plays a coordinating role, plays an organizing role, and within the structure, has a formal relationship with these local entities. There's going to be, there will be local power grabs in this scenario. That will happen. And of course, people will try to elevate themselves beyond what they should. The concept behind devolution of power, though, is that the stakes aren't as high because we have power grabs at the central government level that are much more ferocious and much fiercer because the stakes are so much higher. You get control of an entire country if you get the central government, and you get control of their treasury, more to the point for a lot of folks. So by devolving power, you're not getting rid of any of these actors who are going to, who want to have an outsized role and outsized influence in the power dynamics of the country, but you're involving more people in decision making. You are making it harder for any one actor or small group of actors to wield damaging power. It would really have to be based on organic, legitimate entities, like locally, right? Like you could try to set them up, but you really want to look for, like I say, entities that have some level of legitimacy already with the local people. And you still want to do this in a democratic framework. You want to make sure you have elections, even at the local level, of course. And this is not the appropriate answer for all of these situations, but depending on some of these countries that are so fractured already, I think it's a more realistic approach for some of these countries.
Thank you. A question from Vemba. Looking at Latin America, military coups occurred frequently in response to perceived failures of democratic governments to effectively respond to national crisis. Are circumstances in Africa different?
Thank you for the question. Of course, every situation is different. No situation is alike. Even in the Sahel, Burkina Faso is not Mali. Every situation is different. I think I would like to reiterate that the military, as small as they can be in a country, they still represent an important segment of that society. So the grievances are just as important as the grievances of any other segment of the society. And in the case of Latin America and in the case of Africa, all coups are not created equals. The coups of the 70s were ideological. It was in the context of the Cold War. And they typically had no modicum of popularity. The coups that we're seeing today are totally different, especially the coups that we're talking about in Burkina Faso. They're happening within a specific context. The heightened insecurity, the discontent of the military that is not getting support from the civilian leadership in addressing the causes or getting the support to prosecute the war. Terrorism is a very tricky situation. Even strong countries, rich countries struggle with this. The US struggled with terrorism, and it was not pretty. But it's not been pretty when we deal with terrorism. France, and so on. So to burden a developing nation in the Sahel with the cost of handling terrorism when institutions are weak, it's a tall order. So I'm not here to defend coups, but I want to insist that context. And the history of Africa is replete with coups that went crazy and just took countries down. But there also have been moments of guys who came through coups and took the countries in different direction. Jerry Rawlings, brutal coup, and a few of them. But without Jerry Rawlings, there will not have been a transition to democracy, not at the point that it happened in Ghana. The much celebrated Thomas Sankara was from Burkina Faso. He came through a coup. So I just would like to say context. Again, I'm not here to defend coups, but I think as analysts, we need to take them within the context.
Thank you, Mbemba. Let me look. Cameron, you have a question. The US State Department has special envoy offices for a handful of complex issues and regions, including for the Sahel, though that envoy post is not yet filled. Does this unique role offer operational or diplomatic advantages in a crisis situation? And are there lessons learned from the previous envoy for the Sahel posting?
Great. Well, I do think that there's a lot that can be said about how the U.S. government organizes itself around these issues matters, and personnel is policy, as people say. And so the fact that we don't have someone filling the role of a special envoy to the Sahel, I think, is a gap in our policy, that one that should be fixed. I think we should be, we treat the Sahel as a region, and we treat many of the problems as transnational problems in the Sahel. And so I think we need to be structured in a way internally. If you look, it cuts across, the Sahel region cuts across, the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, in our bureaucratic structure. And so I think we need to have a kind of operational structure that allows for us, to more effectively respond, but also I think to be a part of the wider international community who is engaging on these issues. So when there are, other special envoys that the UN, the EU, European partners, the AU have designated, and there is a process, just as there has been a Great Lakes, policy process for decades now, and now there is an increasingly visible Horn of Africa process underway. I think we need to be at the table diplomatically with respect to the Sahel, and I think that having a Sahel envoy deployed, as we did under the Trump administration, was a really important signal. I think more importantly than just the diplomatic aspect, I go back to, the security aspect. The security engagement that we have in these countries is very visible. And I think our diplomacy needs to be just as visible. And so if only to counterbalance how we are perceived and how our values and interests are perceived locally. I think it makes a ton of sense to have that kind of diplomatic representation. And I think there are ways to do it within the State Department. I mean, you can have a deputy assistant secretary who carries the title of special envoy, right? So you don't have to have an additional person in that role, but having someone there who is identified publicly as a point person on that policy, I think it elevates the policy internally, and it also, I think, just sends a signal, I think, locally and to international partners that the United States is engaged.
Yep. Thanks so much. So, a question for Joe. Joe, you rightly mentioned that the coup makers are a faction of the military. We may make a mistake by generalizing and putting all militaries in the same basket of potential coup makers. But do you think that the U.S. train and equip model is the appropriate model to address the factionalization of the army and strengthen the democratic norms you talked about?
Thanks for the question. No, simply, training and equip is not sufficient. It misses completely the governance and civil military relations norm strengthening values that are so central to an effective democratic professional military. And I think it's the democratic professional military element that we need to be spending more time thinking about. Just building up capabilities of militaries may improve their lethal capacity, but if it isn't grounded in some democratic norms, some understanding that the role of a military is to protect the population, that it should be citizen-centric and looking at citizen security. Unless those norms and values are in place, then that lethal capacity can be used against the civilians. And so I think we need to do a lot more in thinking about how to strengthen those norms and culture of military professionalism, accountability, respect for civilian rule. In the end, this is going to have to come from within the individual countries. But many military professionals in Africa, I know, really embrace those values, and it is extremely disappointing to them to see these coups and the breakdown of the growth and the inculcation of those values that we've seen over the years. And so it is something that needs to be done in partnership with host government institutions. It needs to be done in partnership with civil society. Civil society has a very important role for oversight of the security sector. As I mentioned before, it has to do with partnership with parliaments, legislatures, who need to do more in terms of overseeing military budgets and making sure that those norms are being inculcated within these institutions. You can't just leave it to the executive branch. You just can't leave it to the ministries of defense. And for that matter, it gets to the Ministry of Finance too. What's the Ministry of Finance's role in overseeing how budgetary expenditures are being used and making sure they're for the right things? So, training and equip is important, but it has to be built on a foundation of, what is that training and equipping for? And I think it's that what's the purpose of military, that fundamental question that we really need to be spending more time on and reorienting our efforts towards.
Thank you, Joe. A question from Vemba. Thinking about a return to constitutional order, how many years does it take for a successful transition period? And are free and fair elections a priority at this point in time?
Thank you, Camisa, and thank the member who asked the question. Again, it's relative. I think it's relative. I will continue hammering on the Mali example. Mali was a success story until it was no longer a success story. And it was a success story because Malians, including the military that had taken power in, I think, 1991, whatever year that was, there was enough pressure on them to stand down. They kept their word, they would stand down in 1 year. And Mali went on forward as a democracy. Mali, when at the time you read a report of the State Department, there were no political prisoners in Mali, human rights, it was a good bill of rights, that good bill of health that Mali had. But Mali did not get the support that as a young democracy they deserve to get. And so the transition could not fall from the sky. The international community just did not engage Mali. Mali never got any props, never got any applause for what it was doing. US presidents, other presidents rather go to other countries that were in the grip of dictators than to go to Mali. Not a single US president ever stopped in Mali during the glorious years of Mali as a budding democracy. What message was the world sending? People rather stop in Kampala, in Kigali, and other places. Nobody gave Mali any love. So it takes a while to have democracy, but democracy doesn't grow unto itself. Democracy is expensive, very expensive. All the institutions that Joe mentioned early, the courts, civil society organization, political parties, and others, to help build those takes a lot of money. And a country like Mali is not going to get that money overnight. So to me, the transition should take as long as it needs, but with the support. Otherwise, there's no transition. We're going to revert to authoritarianism.
Thank you, Bemba. A question to all of you. Good one. We have mentioned democratic institutions, but we seem to forget the private sector. Do you see any role for the business sector in strengthening democratic norms, and how can the US support? Josh?
Yes, is my answer. Absolutely. I think private sector is really important part of this. There's very strong correlation between economic freedom and good governance. And I think having a vibrant entrepreneurial private sector that, and obviously the US private sector can help with this through investment and trade and et cetera, is critical. Both because it addresses some of these issues, such as a lack of jobs that fuel so much frustration on the continent, particularly among the youth, and we're all familiar with the youth explosion happening there now. They have to get their economies going, some of these countries, or they are going to face severe societal unrest for the foreseeable future, I think. And obviously, private sector is the only answer to that. And I think there is something about people involving themselves in business and in entrepreneurial activity, and having some control over their own economic fates, that lends itself to a more democratic environment. I think that if you can, and this is somewhat low-hanging fruit for some of these countries, because you look at the regulatory environments in a lot of them, and they're irrational and onerous and everything else. And if you could just rationalize some of that and some of those regulatory environments, you could make really significant gains, not just economically, but again, as I say, I think in strengthening the legitimacy of governments, in buttressing institutions that are important to good governance. There's a lot of positive knock-on effects.
Thank you, Josh. So we're slowly coming to the end of our discussion. And
can I just jump in for 2 minutes on that?
Sure. Go ahead.
I just piggybacking on Josh. I think it's such an important question. that does get often overlooked. And I would say, it's really ironic. We're in this period where there's this democratic recession in Africa, but it's a place where there's a larger middle class, there are more people in the middle class, more educated Africans than ever before. And so this huge paradox of, why aren't there more domestic constituents and institutions that are pushing back for these democratic norms? And so I think it's a really critical role that the private sector can play. These middle-class professionals, entrepreneurs, they have a lot to lose if we see the return of coups and military governments, because the whole concept of rule of law goes out the window. And with that, investment dries up. As the saying goes, capital is a coward. And if there's instability, if there's political instability, that international capital on which new investment and production it depends won't be there. And so a lot is at stake for Africa's private sector, that to see these coups reversed and a restoration of rules-based government, that then ties into property rights, access to credit, access to certifications that often are politicized in unaccountable governments. Unfortunately, the reality is political autocracies turn into economic autocracies. And so we can expect to see the same things with these military governments. So it's a really important issue for right now when we're looking at how you push back. But it's also an important issue for looking forward in terms of how do you sustain democratic governments and how do you tap into the synergies between a vibrant private sector and a participatory, accountable democratic government.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Cameron, do you want to add anything to the question?
No, just to underline, I think, again, we have these U.S. government institutions already in place. I mean, we have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is intended to reinforce countries that are on a democratic path, right? And to give them that kind of transformational economic boost that they need to unlock their democratic potential and economic potential. Similarly, we have the Development Finance Corporation, which is now, I think, merged multiple organizations of the U.S. government to try to streamline our ability to focus private sector capital in places that are deserving of it and that can benefit from it. But I think we just have to remember that, at the end of the day, these companies that are going in there, they're not benevolent. They're going in there to mine, to take things out of the earth or to sell products on the ground. And I do think that there's an indirect effect of having U.S. companies which have to ascribe to U.S. law on corruption and transparency, bringing those business ideals to these countries. But we have to remember that there has to be, first and foremost, a welcoming environment for the private sector to be able to go in and to make those commitments.
Thank you, Cameron. So to all of you, I think you all agreed on one thing. We need to expand our toolkit to be able to counter coups in sub-Saharan Africa. And some of the key points that I noted down, the first one is that the U.S. should carve a bigger space for civil society in the region. The ECOWAS and the EU should take a hard line with constitutional coups and should abide by their respective charters in order to regain the legitimacy that they once had in the region. The U.S. needs to rethink its security approach in the region. Train and equip doesn't work anymore or is not sufficient. Joe mentioned a hard line that is needed with coup makers because they are politically vulnerable and sanctions are a way of taking a hard line. And Cameron, you insisted on working with non-elite local level authorities who actually are authorities or people who believe in democracy, like Afrobarometer confirmed. Any last words of wisdom before we close in 2 minutes? Vemba.
I would just, sorry, go ahead.
Cameron, go ahead.
Well, I'll be briefer than 30 seconds. I was just going to say, I think our consistency across the board matters because, I'm struck by something that the Mali and your successor said, Malian foreign minister said recently, which was, France applauds coups when it's in their interest and it condemns coups when it's not in their interest. And I think that we have to be consistent about how we respond to these coups because Africans see how we're responding and they see the hypocrisy in our policies when we engage in Chad because it serves our interests and we don't engage in Mali because we don't like the flavor of the coup there. And so I think we have to have consistency in how and why and where we are responding and in the manner in which we're responding because we will be called out and lose credibility to the people who we're trying to influence on the ground there.
Thank you, Cameron. Vemba, 10 seconds.
All right. Africans want democracy. They've been working on democracy for a long time. Coups happen in the process. We need to stick with them. They are the example. South Korea, which is a power now, was not a piece of cake in its day. They had coups. The US never relented on them. They stuck with them. I think the time has come for the international community, particularly the US, since I'm in the US, to pick a few countries and support them all the way through until they make it. It's not a 2-year experiment. So we need to start putting our money where our principles are.
Thank you so much. Josh, final words?
Yeah, I would just reiterate the importance of local actors. I think that's been a theme here. Civil society, absolutely critical. Building these institutions that are the protectors of democracy and that can defend it against things like coups. That's a long, it's a long, hard road. And I totally agree with them, but I think Joe made the same point. We need to stick with it. We need to have a much longer time horizon on solving some of these problems that we can't even solve anyways. We need to, again, come alongside local actors who are fighting this fight.
Thank you. Joe, can you be as short as George?
Yeah, I'll be very succinct. I think, our strategy should be to link up with domestic actors, so bring the combination of domestic pressure and international pressure. Don't just try to work this through elite level formal structures. I think in that way we can most leverage our influence and get these things back on track.
Thank you so much to all of you for this very rich discussion and for providing response options to coups in the Greater Sahel. I would like to also thank our audience for joining us. For those interested in following USIP's work more closely after today, I encourage you to follow USIP on social media, sign up for our email newsletter, and tune in for more virtual events. Thank you and goodbye.